December 1945. Southern Germany is quiet now. Snow settles over narrow country roads near Mannheim, muffling the sound of engines and footsteps alike. The war that once thundered across these fields has been over for 7 months. No artillery, no tank columns, no orders shouted under fire. General George S. Patton, Jr., sits in the back seat of a U.S. Army sedan, not in a command jeep, not at the head of an armored spearhead, just another officer on a winter morning. His Third Army has conquered Europe at full speed, across France, through the Ardennes, and deep into the heart of Germany. But now there is nothing left to conquer, only occupation, paperwork, silence. Patton stares out the window. He has spoken openly about his frustration with peace, about his belief that the war ended unfinished. His words have already reached Washington, so have the complaints. Ahead, a simple army truck slows unexpectedly at an intersection. There is no warning shot, no enemy ambush, no battlefield glory, just steel momentum, and a moment that history did not expect. The war spared George Patton. Peace did not. And in the weeks that followed, America would be left asking a question it still debates today. What really happened to Patton after World War II ended? May 1945 ended the war in Europe, but it did not bring clarity. It brought ruins. From the Atlantic coast to the Oder River, cities lay broken open. Rail lines twisted like wire. Bridges collapsed into rivers that no longer carried traffic, only debris. More than 40 million Europeans were dead. Millions more wandered the continent without homes, without governments, without certainty. The Allied armies that had fought together now faced a different task. They were no longer advancing. They were occupying. Germany was divided into zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin itself was carved apart. Victory had been achieved by unity, but peace would be defined by control. Every road, factory, and office building became a point of negotiation. For the United States Army, the mission shifted overnight. Combat commands were replaced by military governments. Armored divisions were ordered to police civilians. Generals who had spent years moving at speed were told to slow down and administer. The Soviet Union, still an ally on paper, now stood across fixed lines. Its armies did not withdraw east. Instead, they fortified positions. Intelligence reports began to change tone. Words like partner faded. Words like intent and influence replaced them. In Washington, priorities hardened quickly. Stability mattered more than vengeance. Reconstruction mattered more than punishment. German industry, once targeted for destruction, was now seen as necessary for European recovery and as a counterweight to Soviet power. This shift created tension. Not all American commanders agreed with it. Some believed Germany should be tightly controlled, its military potential permanently broken. Others believed the greater danger now lay elsewhere. George Patton stood firmly in the second camp. He had fought Germany at its strongest and beaten it decisively. To him, the war had proven who the real enemy was and who was no longer one. He spoke bluntly, sometimes recklessly, about the Soviet Union. He questioned policies of denazification. He believed occupation should be firm but pragmatic, not ideological. These views were not whispered in private. They were voiced aloud, to reporters, to subordinates, and sometimes to anyone within earshot. In a world desperately trying to stabilize, Patton's certainty felt less like leadership and more like a liability. And that tension followed him into the final chapter of his command. By the summer of 1945, George S. Patton, Jr. was one of the most recognizable military figures in America. He had commanded the U.S. Third Army through some of the fastest, most aggressive operations of the European War. From the breakout at Normandy to the relief of Bastogne, Patton's formations moved with a speed that astonished both allies and enemies. His reputation was built on momentum, never letting the enemy recover, never allowing hesitation to set in. But that same force of personality had always carried risk. Patton spoke the way he fought, directly, without filters. During the war, battlefield success often insulated him from consequences. After the war, that insulation disappeared. As military governor of Bavaria under the U.S. occupation system, Patton now answered to political authorities as much as military ones. His job was no longer to defeat Germany, but to manage it. That meant enforcing denazification policies, supervising civilian administrations, and maintaining order among a defeated population. Patton struggled with the role. He publicly compared former Nazi Party members to American political affiliations, comments that quickly reached the press. He questioned the logic of removing experienced administrators simply because of party membership. To Patton, efficiency mattered more than symbolism. To Washington, symbolism mattered deeply. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, had long valued Patton's combat abilities. But Eisenhower also understood the fragility of the post-war moment. He needed discipline, restraint, and consistency. Patton offered none of those qualities outside of battle. By September 1945, the pressure became unavoidable. Patton was removed as military governor of Bavaria and reassigned to command the U.S. 15th Army, a unit tasked not with fighting, but with writing histories of the war. To Patton, it was a demotion in everything but rank. He still wore 4 stars, but he no longer held influence. No troops were maneuvering under his command. No campaigns awaited his direction. His days were filled with administrative routines and ceremonial duties. Privately, he made no effort to hide his bitterness. Friends noticed the change. So did subordinates. The man who thrived on movement was now stationary. The general who lived for conflict was surrounded by peace and visibly chafed against it. Patton had survived Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. What awaited him now was something he had never learned to fight. Stillness. And it was in that stillness that the final sequence of events began to take shape. War gave Patton clarity, peace took it away. For more than 3 years, his life had followed a simple rhythm: plan, attack, advance. Decisions were immediate, consequences were visible. Victory, when it came, was unmistakable. In that environment, Patton was at his best. After the war, that structure collapsed. Letters from the period reveal restlessness. He complained of boredom. He described occupation duty as lifeless. Friends recalled that he spoke often about wanting another war, not because he loved destruction, but because conflict gave his life purpose. This was not unique to Patton. Many senior commanders struggled after 1945, but Patton struggled publicly. He lacked the ability or desire to soften his views. The discipline that restrained others did not restrain him. Hunting trips became one of his few escapes. They offered movement, routine, and a sense of command, even if only briefly. On horseback or in the field, Patton appeared closer to himself than he did behind a desk. Yet even in these moments there was tension. He knew his career was effectively over. Promotion was unlikely. Another major command was improbable. The army was changing, and Patton did not fit its future. The war had ended. But for Patton, the sense of unfinished business had not. To American leadership, Patton was becoming unpredictable. His statements on the Soviet Union were particularly troubling. In private, many officers shared his distrust. In public, few dared voice it. The alliance with Moscow was fragile, and any suggestion of hostility risked diplomatic fallout. Patton ignored that reality. He spoke openly about the Red Army's intentions. He questioned why former enemies were being disarmed while new ones were being tolerated. These remarks were recorded, reported, and relayed upward. Washington had no interest in removing Patton entirely. He was too famous, too decorated, but it had every interest in containing him. The reassignment to the 15th Army served that purpose. It kept Patton visible but powerless, honored but sidelined. The decision was administrative, not personal, yet to Patton it felt like betrayal. He had won battles that reshaped the war. Now he was being managed. And that management placed him in exactly the wrong frame of mind for what came next. Post-war Germany was a moral minefield. Denazification aimed to remove all Nazi influence from public life. In theory, it was absolute. In practice, it was messy. Millions had held party membership. Entire bureaucracies depended on experienced administrators who had served under the regime. Patton saw the contradiction immediately. He believed the policy punished efficiency and rewarded incompetence. He argued that many Germans joined the party for survival, not ideology. To him, blanket punishment was unjust and impractical. These views clashed directly with Allied policy. What Patton saw as realism, others saw as moral blindness. What he considered military necessity, others viewed as dangerous tolerance. The divide widened quickly. And as pressure mounted from the press, from politicians, from fellow officers, Patton became increasingly isolated. All of these forces, personal frustration, political containment, and moral conflict, were converging. They did not cause what happened next, but they shaped the world Patton entered on a cold December morning. By late 1945, Patton commanded no moving army. The 15th Army existed largely on paper. Its mission was historical, collecting records, analyzing campaigns, documenting decisions. Important work, but abstract. There were no field exercises, no operational urgency, no chance to lead men under pressure. For a commander defined by action, it was a quiet erasure. Patton maintained discipline. He appeared at functions. He inspected units, but those close to him sensed detachment. His edge dulled not from age but from disuse. He was a warrior without a battlefield. The Army, too, was transforming. Demobilization reduced forces rapidly. Officers who had risen quickly during wartime were now surplus. The institution was shifting toward bureaucracy, planning, and long-term strategy. Patton had little patience for any of it. He had once said that a soldier's greatest fear was not death, but irrelevance. In peace, that fear followed him constantly. And in that psychological space, between past glory and future uncertainty, small moments took on outsized weight. Even as the world celebrated peace, planners were already looking ahead. Soviet forces remained in Eastern Europe. Intelligence reports tracked their movements closely. Conversations inside Allied headquarters quietly acknowledged that the wartime alliance was unlikely to survive. Patton saw this earlier than most, and said so more loudly. He believed the Red Army posed a strategic threat, while American forces still held overwhelming advantage. He argued that waiting would only strengthen a future adversary. These views were unacceptable in the political climate of 1945. The United States was demobilizing. The public wanted soldiers home, not new wars. Any suggestion of conflict with the Soviet Union risked panic and diplomatic crisis. To senior leadership, Patton's rhetoric was no longer just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Yet there is no evidence he was silenced by force. He was constrained by structure, moved aside, neutralized by routine. That distinction matters. Because when the accident came, it did not occur in secrecy or darkness. It happened in daylight on a public road, involving standard military vehicles, witnessed by multiple people. And still questions followed. Because timing matters. And because history often scrutinizes moments where loud voices fall suddenly silent. All of these pressures, personal stagnation, institutional change and geopolitical tension, converged in December 1945. They did not cause the crash, but they framed how the world would interpret it. The morning of December 9, 1945, was cold and clear. Patton had arranged a pheasant hunting trip near Mannheim, a routine excursion he had taken before. Riding with him in the sedan were Major General Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, and Private First Class Horace Woodring, who was driving. A separate vehicle followed behind. The route was familiar. The roads were narrow but serviceable, winding through a landscape still scarred by war yet quiet in its aftermath. At approximately 11:45 a.m., the sedan approached a railway crossing near the village of Ketch. Ahead, a U.S. Army II, a half-ton truck driven by technician 5th grade Robert L. Thompson, slowed suddenly to make a left turn. Woodring applied the brakes, but the distance was too short. The sedan struck the rear of the truck at low speed. The impact itself was not dramatic. The vehicles were not destroyed. No fire followed. Those in the truck were largely unharmed. Gay suffered minor injuries. Patton did not. Thrown forward from the back seat, he struck his head against the metal partition separating the driver's compartment. His neck absorbed the force. Immediately, he complained that he could not feel his hands or legs. Witnesses recalled the sudden stillness. No chaos, no shouting, just realization. Medical personnel were summoned at once. Patton remained conscious, alert, and aware of the severity of his condition. He reportedly told those around him not to worry about him, but to care for the others. He was transported first to a field hospital, then moved to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, one of the best-equipped facilities in the U.S. zone. Initial examinations revealed a severe fracture of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. The war's most aggressive general had survived shellfire, air attacks, and armored combat. But in peace, a single moment of momentum had broken him. And while Patton was alive, the direction of his life had changed irrevocably. At the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, the reality of Patton's injuries became unmistakable. X-rays confirmed a fractured cervical spine centered around the third and fourth vertebrae. The spinal cord had been damaged. Patton was paralyzed from the neck down. He could move his head slightly, but his arms and legs were unresponsive. Despite the severity of the injury, his mind remained sharp. Doctors stabilized his neck with traction and immobilization. In 1945, spinal medicine was limited. There were no advanced surgical options, no modern intensive care units. Treatment focused on preventing further damage and managing complications. Patton understood the situation almost immediately. He asked direct questions. He listened carefully to the answers. He did not ask for false reassurance. To those around him, he remained composed, even courteous. Visitors noted that he spoke calmly, sometimes with dry humor, sometimes with resignation. General Eisenhower visited. So did other senior officers. Conversations were brief, controlled. No one spoke openly about prognosis, but everyone understood the implications. For a man who had commanded armies, immobility was a punishment worse than death. In the days that followed, Patton developed complications common to spinal injuries of the era. His lungs weakened. He struggled to clear secretions. His condition fluctuated, moments of stability followed by sudden decline. On December 20, doctors noted pulmonary congestion. By the following morning, he was struggling to breathe. In the early hours of December 21, 1945, George S. Patton Jr. died from pulmonary edema and heart failure resulting from his spinal injury. He was 60 years old. There was no final speech, no dramatic last words, just a quiet end in a hospital room far from any battlefield. The accident had not killed him outright, but it had made survival impossible. And with his death, questions began almost immediately, not about how he died, but about what his death meant. News of Patton's death traveled quickly. On December 21, 1945, the announcement reached Washington, London, and across occupied Europe within hours. For many Americans, it came as a shock. The war's most aggressive general had survived its bloodiest campaigns, only to die after peace had already been declared. Official statements were restrained. The army cited complications from a spinal injury sustained in a traffic accident. There was no emphasis on drama, no attempt to elevate the moment. In a nation exhausted by war, attention was already shifting toward homecomings and reconstruction. Yet within military circles, the reaction was heavier. Patton had been divisive, but no one questioned his impact. Officers who disagreed with him still acknowledged his brilliance in mobile warfare. Soldiers who served under him remembered his demands, but also his presence at the front, his insistence on momentum, his refusal to accept delay. Eisenhower issued a formal statement praising Patton's courage and leadership. It was carefully worded, respectful, measured, final. The funeral was conducted with full military honors. Patton's body was transported to Luxembourg, where he was buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, alongside the men of the Third Army he had led through Europe. His widow, Beatrice, requested the location. Patton had once said he wished to be buried with his soldiers. The symbolism was unmistakable. Public mourning was real but brief. The United States was demobilizing millions of troops. Veterans were returning home. The nation was already looking forward. Still, among those who knew Patton, the manner of his death felt incomplete. A life defined by movement had ended in stillness. A man who survived constant danger had fallen in a moment without enemies. And in that contrast, curiosity began to grow. Because history often struggles to accept quiet endings, especially for men whose lives were anything but. Even as Patton's funeral concluded, whispers and questions began to circulate. Why had such a vigorous, capable man been vulnerable in a routine vehicle accident? How had a general who survived artillery barrages, tank assaults, and air attacks succumbed to a momentary collision on a quiet road? The circumstances, military vehicles, a standard intersection, a seemingly avoidable collision, invited scrutiny. Official Army reports were thorough. They recorded times, witnesses, vehicle types, and medical findings. The investigation concluded that it was an accident. No negligence on Patton's part, no foul play, no mechanical failure beyond normal handling. The truck driver, Thompson, and the driver of Patton's sedan, Woodring, were exonerated. The incident remained classified as a tragic, unforeseeable accident. Yet speculation persisted. Newspapers, memoirs, and later historians debated whether Patton's outspoken political views had made him a target, whether higher powers had an interest in sidelining a general who challenged post-war policy. Documents show no evidence of such plots, but the questions reflect broader anxieties about his influence and timing. Patton's legacy quickly grew in both size and complexity. Military historians praised his brilliance in maneuver warfare, his ability to adapt armored tactics, and his rapid decision-making under pressure. At the same time, his personality, brash, outspoken, and often politically insensitive, served as a cautionary tale about the tension between military genius and civilian oversight. Post-war documentaries, biographies, and scholarly works repeatedly highlighted the contrast between his battlefield triumphs and his sudden, quiet end. His death became symbolic, a man forged by constant combat, halted by a mundane accident in a world that no longer demanded heroism. Despite the brevity of his final weeks, Patton influenced how the United States Army approached leadership, mobility, and post-war occupation. Future generations studied his campaigns, his strategies, and even his errors, shaping doctrine for armored warfare and rapid deployment. And yet, even as history solidified his legend, questions lingered. Why did someone so indispensable to victory fall so suddenly in peace? How might post-war Europe have been different if Patton's vision of the Soviet threat had been heeded? What lessons were lost because a warrior's life ended before he could fully transition into the era he helped create? His story, therefore, became twofold: the tale of battlefield brilliance and the narrative of a world unprepared to integrate a general whose life was defined by relentless action. George S. Patton Jr.'s life was defined by motion. From the sands of North Africa to the forests of Germany, he thrived in the velocity of war. Every decision, every maneuver, every risk was measured in moments, seconds that could alter the course of a battle. Yet, when the war ended, that same momentum no longer had a target. His death in December 1945 serves as a stark reminder that the end of conflict does not bring clarity for everyone who fights it. For soldiers accustomed to the immediacy of danger, the quiet of peace can be as perilous as the battlefield. Patton faced not enemy fire, but stillness. Not strategic opposition, but routine. Not a decisive maneuver, but an accident that left him paralyzed and ultimately claimed his life. History remembers him as a brilliant tactician, a fiery personality, and an icon of American military power. Yet it also preserves the cautionary tale of a man whose strengths, aggression, decisiveness, audacity, were ill-suited to post-war bureaucracy and diplomacy. In the paradox of his death, there is a lesson. The skills that lead to triumph in war do not always translate to survival in peace. Patton's legacy endures in doctrine, memoirs, and monuments, but it endures most profoundly in the human understanding of war itself. He embodies the truth that history does not end neatly. Battles are fought, enemies are defeated, yet the consequences of war ripple long after the last shot is fired. The general who lived and died by action reminds us that the cost of peace can be just as unpredictable as the fury of combat. And in the quiet of December 1945, amid snow-laden roads and silent forests, the life of George S. Patton concluded, not with the roar of artillery, but with a stillness that left the world to wonder, remember, and reflect.